This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is entitled Revisions to Disability Category Criteria Within a Comprehensive Special Education Evaluation. Our presenters today are Daniel Parker and Ryan McNamara. Daniel is the Assistant Director of Special Education at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and Ryan is a school administration consultant with the DPI. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Daniel and Ryan.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to all of you joining us today. It's great to be here with Wisconsin Facets and my colleague Ryan, who I'll be introducing here in just a little bit. My name is Daniel Parker, and I am an Assistant Director at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. We're going to start off talking a little bit about how disability category criteria fit within a comprehensive special education evaluation. Ryan is going to give you some overview of some of the updates that we're making to disability category criteria IEP forms and how that needs to be documented, in addition to some changes we made to documentation on our evaluation report IEP form to ensure that specially designed instruction is noted that is needed for students to be eligible to receive special education services through an IEP. And then the meat of what we're going to be doing is going over the disability criteria. I should note that Ryan and I are not specifically experts in any one disability category. I do have more knowledge of emotional behavioral disabilities from my training. But the presentation on disability category criteria was developed by content specialists at the Department of Public Instruction. And I'm going to be sharing resources of where to go deeper, and we're just providing a broad overview of what they want, of what those folks who are experts in these areas of this disability category criteria want all of you to know, kind of as a general overview of what you should be aware about of some of the changes to this criteria. I always like to just point out that our presentations align with the high leverage practices created by the Cedar Center and the Council for Exceptional Children, and you can see those on the slide. So let's talk about how disability category criteria should be considered in the context of a comprehensive special education evaluation. It's important to note that the term comprehensive special education evaluation is actually a specific requirement both in state and federal special education regulations, and there's the statutes there. And also it's important to note that a comprehensive special education evaluation exists within a district's equitable multi-level system of support. A comprehensive special education evaluation should have collective responsibility of parents, families, general educators, special educators, related service providers, everyone working together to identify that student's unique strengths, assets, and needs so that they can have a full picture of that student and thinking about when special education is needed within a continuum of supports. Special education evaluation is not disability category specific. The quote from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act specifically states, the evaluation, meaning a special education evaluation, is sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the child's special education and related service needs, whether or not commonly linked to the disability category in which the child has been classified. So, this has been around. This is not new. This has been an IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Our federal law applies to every state in the country, and all IEPs, all evaluations to consider if a student is eligible for special education. So what does that mean when we say it needs to be significantly comprehensive, and why are we using that terminology in some of our updated guidance at DPI? Well, we really want to move from people thinking this is an autism evaluation, or this is a intellectual disability evaluation. So let me find the autism criteria checklist. This is what I assess, and then boom, the student qualifies, and then we'll develop the IEP and then put them into an autism program. That is very label focused, and the danger of that is, what if the student with autism has reading needs and reading academic needs isn't on the checklist for the autism criteria? Or what if you have a student with a specific learning disability who has some behavioral needs, and looking at a student's behavioral needs isn't specifically a part of the criteria for specific learning disability? What a comprehensive special education evaluation requires, and this is true of every evaluation or reevaluation, is that we move away from just thinking about checking boxes for criteria. We have to do that. That gives you very valuable, useful information. But we also need to be thinking of the whole child. What other needs potentially are there based on the referral and the review of existing data that we need to be thinking about so that we're not going to miss anything? I mentioned the review of existing data, and my just tip for IEP teams and evaluators is to be thinking, when you see a referral for special education, there's some concerns listed. There might be academic or functional or social emotional concerns, but when you do a review existing data and you gather a team, including the parent and family, and ask questions about, like, what do we know about this student? What are people saying? What's our existing information about this student? What do we know from general education? What observations have already been done? Is there medical records that we already have, et cetera? It really can help you identify the questions. Are there some social emotional needs we should look into? Are there medical or health needs? You know, in addition to considering what disability category, you also want to pause and think about, look at the whole child. Let's not miss anything so that we can make sure we have a comprehensive special education evaluation. A major reason for doing this is because evaluations, if the student is found eligible for special education, the next step is to develop a child's individualized education program, right? And the IEP must be also comprehensive, and it is not limited to identifying disability-related needs commonly associated with a disability category. So if you do a comprehensive special education evaluation up front, when you go to the IEP development, you're going to ensure that the content of the child's IEP includes information related to enabling the child to be involved in and progress in general education and curriculum and or age-appropriate activities for our early learners. So, you know, it's important to think that the purpose of evaluations is not just to find the child eligible, but the purpose is to have enough information to have a really good IEP. So it's very important that we identify all those strengths, assets, and needs up front. Be aware that if you're just looking at disability category label and just the criteria, and that's the only thing you look at, and you don't even discuss whether or not there's other areas you might want to collect information about, you may not be doing a comprehensive special education evaluation. You may be missing something that you're going to regret later when those concerns show up, and really they should have been identified during the evaluation so that you can document those in the IEP and wrap goals and services around those needs. So it is important to be aware of that. This is not a presentation on comprehensive special education evaluation, but there's a ton of information at DPI on the slide. We have a very comprehensive bulletin on special education evaluation, and we have a whole framework that really goes deep into this. We have some videos that we've already recorded, and there's a lot more coming in the next year on guidance on how to help schools think through this process. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ryan, my colleague, who's going to talk a little bit about documentation of disability category criteria and documenting need for specially designed instruction.
Thank you, Daniel. So I will be discussing some changes to our ER1 evaluation report form, and that summarizes both initial evaluations and reevaluations. And part of the decision to do that last year was the legislative changes to disability categories. So with the need to change the form there, we took the opportunity to align it with comprehensive evaluations and the CCR IEP process. And CCR stands for College and Career Ready. We wanted the form to also work better with the I4 form for IEP development, linking present levels, needs, goals, and services. So part of that revision process was having input from stakeholders, including parents, teachers, related service providers, and administrators. So we asked stakeholders, do you use information from the ER1 when completing the I4 during an IEP team meeting? And how well does information from the ER1 link to various elements on the I4? So based on this data, we identified some room to improve. So not all stakeholders were using information from the evaluation report to help identify the effects of the student's disability or the student's disability-related needs. You can see the highlight there that not all stakeholders were using the ER1 for its primary purpose, which is identifying the need for specially designed instruction. So we set to improving the linkage. So on the next slide, you'll see the section 1 of ER1, which is information from existing data. And the yellow highlights here indicate updated language. So we revised this part significantly. And we wanted to align the form based on the feedback to match the flow of discussion in an IEP team meeting. We want this to feel natural, and we want here to have the existing data, which is information known before the evaluation. So we're looking at relevant information identified during the referral, data about academic and functional skills. And then the next section has information from additional assessments and evaluation materials. And that is information that is from new testing or new data gathered as part of the evaluation. So once we have that information, we incorporate the criteria worksheets to inform the evaluation. So before an IEP team can decide that a student is eligible to receive special education services, the team must have documentation that the student meets at least one of the Wisconsin disability criteria categories in Administrative Code PI 1136. So use of the worksheets, which Daniel will look at in more detail later, it's optional this school year, but applying the criteria rules, some of which are new, and documenting if a student meets the criteria for any disability category, that is not optional. And so the worksheets reflect the current language in the rule. And the next slide, we'll see ER section 3. This is with determination of disability category. IEP teams check the category or categories in which the student meets criteria, and they can attach the worksheets if they're used to document how the student meets the criteria. So you can see in here that some have been updated, renamed. Also, some require forms like the ER2 or ER3. And beginning with next school year in 22-23, all disability criteria worksheets will become required IEP forms. And we're trying to minimize other form changes to help reduce the burden of change on school districts. But we want to make sure that comprehensive evaluation is emphasized here. Now, the criteria worksheets have prompts and space for documenting how a student met or did not meet each component of a criteria for a disability category. Now, it's important that IEP teams document the rationale for why boxes checked yes or no. This explanation, which is highlighted, the prompt ensures that IEP teams discuss each section and give thoughtful consideration instead of just checking a box. It also provides good documentation for future reference. So IEP teams should be summarizing rather than duplicating information found elsewhere in an individual teacher or specialist assessment report. We want the summary to be easy for parents to understand. So here we have the goals we want for the summary statements: concise, objective, parent-friendly, and specific to the individual child. So keep in mind that the assessments themselves can be very technical in language, and we want everything to be described in a parent-friendly manner. And so with the next slide, I wanted to share the definition of needs special education, because it shows that at the core, it's specially designed instruction. And part of the change in the ER1 is that we changed the title to reflect that is now the need for specially designed instruction. And so the next in section 3B of the ER1, we have aligned the how prompt that is highlighted there with the I4 and the CCR IEP terminology. So at this point in an evaluation, the IEP team has reviewed a great deal of information about the students' present levels of academic and functional performance. And they've reviewed criteria related to the disability categories of concern. The IEP team now has sufficient information to consider how the student's disability is affecting the student's access, engagement, and progress in the general education curriculum. This documentation will help inform the development of the IEP in the event that team determines that there is a need for specially designed instruction. And so we continue the alignment with the I4 by asking the IEP team to document the student's disability-related needs. And so we're looking at what skills and behaviors they need to improve and develop so that the student can meet grade and age level expectations. So then the IEP team considers whether the student needs specially designed instruction, or if the student's needs can be met in the general education curriculum with other accommodations. So for instance, that could be a 504 plan. At this point in the evaluation process, the IEP team is ready to explain its decision and then consider and align the services to meet the student's disability-related needs. And then we also added a prompt that is a summary statement to make it clear whether the student needs specially designed instruction. A simple yes or no. And for more information about using the ER1, I just want to point attention to the guide for special education forums. It's at the bottom of that link, which is a handout, and it goes to our PDF on our website. And also bring attention back to page 12 of this handout, which has all the guidance that Daniel talked about for comprehensive evaluations. So yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. And I just wanted to share, if you just do a web search for Wisconsin DPI disability categories, you can see the disability categories in Wisconsin. And if you click on one, all the pages are formatted the same. And to find these criteria worksheets, there's a box for each one that says criteria, and then you can find these worksheets. So again, these worksheets are necessary, but sometimes not sufficient for a comprehensive special education evaluation. They tell you what you absolutely must assess to identify a student as a child with a disability under one of the 12 disability categories, one or more. But then remember, you also, in a comprehensive special education evaluation, may also be collecting other information of concern, right? That you want to have so that you are looking at the whole child. And then, as Ryan said, this is where you do those kind of explain or reference data. So I just wanted to share where you can find each of these. And these are what Ryan said will be required forms starting next year. And a lot of districts already use them. A lot of districts tell us they already thought they were required. And as Ryan pointed out, it's always been a requirement that you have to document how a student meets that criteria. So using these worksheets, and next year the forms will count as that documentation. We were going to pause right now to see if there's any burning questions before we go into sort of the meat, which is a broad overview of the changes to about 6 of the disability category criteria.
Actually, 2 of the questions you just about answered, and that's where you can find the new worksheets and if parents could have access to them, and you just showed that. And the other one is starting next year, then will every school district then be required to use DPI forms, or can they morph them to use their own?
Ryan, would you like to respond to that, or would you like me?
Sure. So districts can use our forms directly, or they can work with vendors who we work with to make sure that the vendor forms meet the requirements. So either route works. Districts have flexibility there.
Okay, that's all I have at this time.
Great. Yeah. So let's go into learning objective 3. Let's talk about these broad changes in disability category criteria. And so let's do first, here's kind of a graph of what changed, okay? And blind and visually impaired, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf-blind, which is a new disability category, emotional behavioral disability, speech or language impairment, and specific learning disability didn't change majorly, but there's an emergency rule that just only addresses evaluations in parentally placed private schools and homeschool situations. So it doesn't change what the district process for specific learning disability for students enrolled in public school, but for it only has a change to parentally placed private school and homeschool students. So we're going to go through those. I do just want to point out that we recognize at the department that when we initiated these rule changes, there's a lot of steps that we have to go through to change a rule. A rule is in Wisconsin administrative rules. It has the power of law. It clarifies the statutes, and it can be extremely lengthy process. And we initiated all of these rules, with the exception of that emergency rule, prior to COVID. So we had no idea when we started this process that we would be in a situation like COVID. You can see that this requires hearings and public input, and then revisions, and then the legislative council the legislature can request revisions. And every time we do that, it sets back the timeline. So we initially thought that these were going to go into effect much earlier than they did, and there's just natural delays in the process. And we don't have a lot of control over the filing of the rule, because once it gets approved, it goes into effect. So we recognize that the timing with COVID was not what we wanted either. But hopefully districts, what we've heard from the majority of these rules, certainly from stakeholders, was very positive. And when you really dig into some of the rules, a lot of IEP teams and evaluators that were doing really high quality current research-based evaluations, they're shifting pretty easily into these changes. So there's not too many massive changes to the rules that we're going to talk about. So let's talk about blind and visually impaired. It's defined as even after correction, a child's vision functioning adversely affects educational performance. So that's part of the definition of blind and visually impaired. Some things to know is that there is a requirement for an ocular report from an optometrist or ophthalmologist. That is still required. Any condition that adversely affects a child's visual functioning can be considered. So there's a little broadness in that. So it can be any condition. And one important thing to keep in mind is a licensed orientation mobility specialist must conduct an O&M assessment. And O&M, I'm sorry, there's an acronym on there, stands for orientation and mobility. So that's a special type of assessment, and there's a specific type of person, a specialist, that has to conduct that. And that is a requirement in the new rule that they conduct that assessment if you're considering blind and visual impairment. So to identify a student with blindness or visual impairment, your child's IEP team is going to be considering whether there is a current ocular report, the functional vision assessment, learning media assessment, and there's also something called the expanded core curriculum. I would encourage you to just web search expanded core curriculum. I don't have enough time today to go into it, but it's for both blind and visually impaired, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind students. Expanded core curriculum are kind of those essential skills in addition to traditional skills that any student may need that are specific to their hearing or vision conditions. And it's a type of assessment that can kind of enhance the quality of the skills and supports being developed in a student's IEP. There's lots of family-friendly resources after each section. There's direct links to all of the documents that really give a deeper dive into this. and more information. And we always encourage you to reach out to the Wisconsin Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired Outreach Program for more information. There's their link there. Their outreach service specialists are amazing, and they can answer any question you may have about blind and visual impairment. The next one is deaf and hard of hearing. Deaf and hard of hearing is defined as a decreased ability to detect sound in one or both ears with or without amplification, whether permanent or chronically fluctuating, which adversely affects a child's educational performance. Some updated terminology came along with this rule. This used to be considered hearing impairment prior to the change in the rule, and based on stakeholder input and alignment with federal definition, the term was changed. This disability category name was changed to deaf and hard of hearing. Also, a language in the rule that was previously called significant impairment in hearing was changed to decreased ability to detect sound. This change was also in alignment with the federal definition and guidance. Some other changes to this rule. In the previous rule, there were subsections of the rule. Many of our disability category rules have certain sections that students have to meet to be able to be eligible. And in the previous rule, there were 3 sections, and in the current rule, they kind of pulled those out and created 4 sections. So in the current rule, there's academic performance, speech perception, speech production, or communication, including language acquisition or expression. So there's now 4 subsections to the rule. To identify a student who's deaf or hard of hearing, your child's IEP team will consider the following: an evaluation that includes a teacher of the deaf. So there is a requirement in this rule that there is a teacher of deaf who is a part of the evaluation team. A current evaluation conducted by a licensed audiologist. And then again, there's that link and that language about expanded core curriculum that I talked about earlier. The link to the expanded core curriculum for blind and visually impaired is a little different than the expanded core curriculum for deaf or hard of hearing. They're two similar but separate documents, but both of them are useful. Again, there's a lot of resources, including resources specifically for families. And we always recommend that you reach out to the Wisconsin West DHH. We have an outreach program for deaf or hard of hearing that you can reach out to as well. All right, let's talk about one of the new disability category criteria, deaf-blind. Wisconsin did not have a deaf-blind disability category written into state rule. We did identify students as deaf-blind through the Wisconsin Deaf-Blind Technical Assistance Project. It's a federally funded project, and they work with us through DPI to help identify deaf-blind students. But we now are in alignment with the federal definition of deaf-blind and have our own disability category. The definition is that deaf-blind is concomitantly deaf or hard of hearing and blind or visually impaired, the combination of which causes severe communication and other developmental and educational needs such that the individual disability-related needs of the student extend beyond the instructions and supports required for a student who is solely deaf or hard of hearing or solely blind or visually impaired. There's also a requirement of IEP team members here. You might see a kind of a common theme about these disability category criteria changes. One of them is that there's some required people that need to be in these conversations when determining whether a student meets criteria across these disability categories. For deaf-blind, you need to make sure that you have a teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing that is licensed with that appropriate license to be a member of the IEP team. In addition, outlined below, IEP teams should pay specific attention to the fact that deaf-blind has been added as its own disability category area, and teams are required to refer to disability category criteria forms for both deaf or hard of hearing and blind and visually impaired when considering deaf-blind as a disability category. Really important point here, a student can be identified as deaf-blind if they meet one of the following. So you could either meet both of the criteria for deaf and hard of hearing and blind and visually impaired. So both of the disability category criteria, those forms that we showed you, if you meet all of the criteria for both of those, you could be you can be eligible for deafblind. Student can be eligible, not eligible for deafblind. Student can be identified as a student as deafblind. The other way is that they have documented hearing and vision loss that, if considered individually, may not meet the requirements for deaf or hard of hearing and blind and visually impaired, but the combination of which causes severe communication and other developmental and educational needs, such that the individual disability-related needs of the student extend beyond the instructions and supports required for a student who is solely deaf or hard of hearing or solely blind or visually impaired. So you don't have to meet both of those criteria specifically. You can, an IEP team decision can determine that a student qualifies if they meet that second condition. And if you're not sure, like, I just don't know, how do we tell? If you're asking that question right now, contact the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project. They are, again, a federally funded project. They're amazing staff. They are there to help IEP teams kind of talk through these requirements and this criteria. They have lots of experience in understanding the needs of deafblind students and identifying those needs, give you lots of tips and recommendations for evaluation in IEP teams. And they support families, school districts, and agencies through training, consultation, and resources. Assessment and data collection. If deaf blindness is suspected, the team may contact the WDB TAP, again, or the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Outreach Program, or Wisconsin Center Blind for Visually Impaired Program. Those three organizations all work closely together. Again, amazing staff, can't say enough about them, and highly recommend if you are a parent, you might request that someone, you can contact them, find out information. If you're a school district, you can reach out to them as well. And also, WDB TAP also supports children birth through 21. They're the only one of those programs that actually does the birth to 3 in addition to the 3 through 21. So let's talk about speech or language impairment. This is the definition here on this slide. I'm not going to read this one. This is a simple definition, but speech or language impairment, if you pull up the criteria form on the webpage, you'll find that there's a lot of sections where a student can qualify, and it's a more lengthy rule, but students just have to qualify under certain types of conditions, and then meet some of the other additional criteria in the rule. So here's some things that you need to know for speech language impairment. Accurate identification of students really also looks at including students who are culturally and linguistically diverse, historically misidentified. So one of the focuses is, they really want to make sure that students identified for speech and language impairment, that it's actually a speech and language impairment and not a difference in their speech or language due to culture or being a culturally linguistically diverse student. So often there's misidentifications. So there's a lot of additional language in the rule that really is pointing to evaluators and IEP teams to make that consideration of whether or not this is really a speech and language impairment or a disability category, or if it's just a language difference. And also the rule was updated to be more in line with some current research. A lot of the current research talks about arbitrary cutoff scores don't really accurately identify students. A lot of norm referenced assessments aren't normed on all student populations. And sometimes just one test doesn't tell you a full picture of a story. Collecting multiple sources of data, having conversations and making really good database decisions is going to lead to more accurate identification than sometimes just looking at it like a cutoff score. So we've often found an over-reliance on norm reference assessments. It doesn't mean that there's not a place for norm reference assessments when identifying speech and language impairment, but the rule just really emphasizes additional data and assessment methods to be identifying whether or not a student really truly has a speech or language impairment, and what is that effect on their education, right? So you also have to be looking at that effect on their education, their social emotional, et cetera. So in addition to ensuring a student meets all the criteria outlined in PI 11, which is the rule, IEP teams really need to also be looking at raising up assessment methods other than norm referenced assessments, so things like observations of students in the natural environment, and that's a required when identifying any type of speech or language impairment. Strong focus on determining language difference from language disorder that I talked about a little bit earlier, and also language addressing reevaluation that I'll talk about here in a second. First, again, I talked about educational impact. When you're doing and looking at that student across environments, what are the observations in natural environments telling you about that student's speech and language and their communicative success? Interviewing classroom teachers and caregivers and families, work samples, language samples, intelligibility, which is looking at, how do people understand the student? Do people familiar with them understand them the same way that people who may not be as familiar with the student, et cetera? Other shifts in the rule, it highlights the augmentative and alternative communication language already in the rule. So there's already AAC language in there, but we kind of highlighted it a little more and how it was worded in the rule to make sure that if a student has a need for alternative, augmentative alternative communication, that that is being assessed. There's an added IEP team member requirement that an educator with foundational knowledge in first and second language acquisition instruction and second language acquisition if the child is identified as an English learner. So for this requirement, it kind of makes sense, right? If you have a student who is identified as an English learner, and that number there is the statute of how to related to identification of English language learners. But if you have a student who's an English language learner and they get a referral for special education, of course you would want someone with knowledge about English language learning and bilingual teachers kind of having input to make sure that the language difficulties that are being seen that are addressing the referral is actually a speech or language impairment, not just language differences associated with being an English learner. So, having someone with that knowledge on the team. We have gotten a lot of questions about that. There's a really good FAQ that goes deeper into what this means. And if you ever had questions about that, you could contact the department and even talk to our speech and language pathologist, Andrea Bertoni. But I would encourage you first to look at some of our FAQs and documents that are linked here. And then I can put in the chat as well that kind of go into these a little more detail. I talked about reevaluation. In a few of our rules, we revised the rule to say that during a reevaluation of the student, that the student does not have to meet all of the initial criteria as long as the IEP team determines the student continues to demonstrate educational impact and a need for special education, meaning a need for specially designed instruction. So it is important to know that during a reevaluation, it will be written into the rule whether that's allowed. And the reason that was written in there is just that some students are making a lot of progress, right? When they're in special education services, and sometimes that student, the IEP team may feel, you know what, I'm not sure if the student would meet the initial criteria, but boy, we really do think that if we just had maybe another few months or another 6 months of services, we would get that student to where they're fully independent and don't need any more specially designed instruction to address their speech or language impairment. So that is an IEP team decision and up to the IEP team, but it really is hinged on whether they determine the student there's still an educational impact on that student's disability and whether there is a need for specially designed instruction. So some things families need to know, look at what your child may be having difficulty or successful with in school. Are they a successful communicator? Do you, as a family member that knows your child, have difficulty understanding what your child is saying? Do other family members who see your child less often than you see your child having more difficulty understanding your child, or do they have more difficulty understanding your child? Do you have difficulty following your child's stories when they come home from school and tell you about their day? Is it kind of difficult? So those might be some red flags to reach out to your school. I mentioned that that all of identification of whether or not a student has a disability and whether they need specially designed instruction fits within a multi-level system of support. Hopefully a school doing a strong, equitable multi-level system of support is including their speech and language pathologists on, mentoring teachers on how to support language development, right? Especially for early learners, et cetera. So, always reach out to your school if you have concerns and see what, they may be able to do to support your child. Because sometimes, students just need a little bit extra support or intervention before that can be done by someone just with some, basic knowledge before, requiring special education services. All right, emotional behavioral disability. From my perspective, again, I am the person who supervises the folks, many of the folks, not all, that were the content experts of these disability categories. And from my perspective, this is the rule that shifted the most, was emotional behavioral disability. So emotional behavioral disability in our Wisconsin statutes and rules means a condition in which a child demonstrates frequent and intense observable behaviors, either of a long period of time or of a sudden onset due to an emerging mental health condition, which includes a diagnosis by a licensed mental health professional, which adversely affects a child's educational performance. The behaviors shall occur in an academic setting in school, in a non-academic setting in school, and in a child's home or community. So why the change to this rule? When we opened up the rule and started talking with stakeholders to talk about what do you think about the rule, we got a lot of feedback that there was, in the previous rule, there was a lot of subjective language in the rule, talking about threat or aggression or inappropriate behaviors. I mean, what does that mean, right? Like, probably we have, I think, 100 and some people registered for this. I'm sure we would not come to consensus on what an appropriate and inappropriate behaviors are for some types of behaviors. Hitting someone, probably everyone says that's inappropriate. But that's inappropriate. It's not a very measurable term. It's very subjective. So we just be observable and measurable so that everyone could agree whether or not it's occurring and you could take data on it. So we really focus on data-based evaluation procedures to make more objective disability identification decisions. And we limited the deficit-based language, things like inappropriate, and utilize language that acknowledges the ecological factors that impact a student's social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. The word ecological shows up in the rule a lot. Basically, the word ecological means that it relates to the environments of living things or the relationships between living things and their environments. Ecological factors can be just kind of that student's environment and where they are and their connections to others. We want to make sure that it's a true disability and not just, again, a difference or something that is not rooted in disability when identifying students for any of the disability categories, including emotional and behavioral disability. And emotional behavioral disability, I think, perhaps arguably, but I think probably statistically, has the most disproportionality of all the disability categories. Disproportionality means that based on race or ethnicity, there are a higher percentage of students identified as emotional behavioral disability than white students. And so, for example, white students are 69% of the population, student population, and make up about 62% of emotional behavioral disability identifications, where Black students only make up 9.1% of the student population, but make up 17.3% of the disability identifications. If I were to show you a graph of deaf-blind, deaf of hard of hearing, or blind and visual impairment, do you think you would see this type of discrepancy? Probably not, because if you are deaf-blind, blind and visually impaired or deaf or hard of hearing, a lot of the criteria looks at medical documentation, right? It's very clear whether or not those students have a disability. When you talk about emotional, behavioral disability, emotions and behavior are very subjective. So we need to make sure that we are seeing equitable kind of distribution of disability, and we're not identifying certain students with disabilities more often based on their race or ethnicity. So a big purpose of the change was try to remove that subjective language, be more objective, have a more robust evaluation system to really address that disproportionality. This is just a quote from C. Bell from a document called Special Needs Under Siege, From Classrooms to Incarceration. And the quote says, as the data continue to show minority students with disabilities are at a greater risk for being suspended, school suspension increases the risk of school dropout, and school dropout increases the likelihood of incarceration. The pathway to incarceration seems to be evident for students of color, minorities, special needs students. So, you know, we're very mindful that emotional and behavioral disability is probably the most stigmatized disability category, and it shouldn't be. There are students who have struggle with their emotions and with their behaviors who need specially designed instruction, but we want to make sure that those are the students who truly have a disability that need that support. Students must exhibit at least one of 7 defining observable characteristics. I'm going to go through these. Again, you can find these all in the rules. One of the characteristics, so it has to be at least one of these. Behaviors must occur in an academic and, okay, so across all of these observable characteristics, I should say, whatever behaviors you see must occur in an academic setting in school, in a non-academic setting in school, and in the student's home or community. So academic setting in school, that's easy during reading class, during a physical education class, during any content area class. Non-academic setting of school might be lunch or recess, things like that. Could be extracurricular activity or a club, and in the student's home or community. So it has to occur in those places. The observable behaviors must be frequent and intense and adversely affect the student's educational performance. The observable behaviors must occur either over a long period of time or of a sudden onset due to an emerging mental health condition, which includes a diagnosis by a licensed mental health professional. That emerging mental health condition was an addition to the rule based on stakeholder feedback, who said that sometimes there are certain mental health conditions that come on very quickly and students need that support as quickly as possible, and they may not have that history of the frequent intense behaviors. So, but to identify that emerging mental health condition, there's a caveat that there has to be a diagnosed by a licensed mental health professional. What IEP teams and family needs to know to conduct a comprehensive special education evaluation, you're also considering current data from the following. So when I said that this is more objective, here's a great example. Look at all the things you need now. You can't just have a conversation about the student's behavior and say, yep, the student has emotional behavioral disability. We need documentation from multiple sources, and we need multiple environments. So we have evidence-based positive behavior interventions, like what were the effects of those behavior interventions? What has been tried that supports? Because if you are doing really quality behavioral interventions, and maybe you're already using some visual schedules, and you're already providing lots of reinforcement, and you're already you know, have like a home base or a space for when the student's frustrated, maybe you're already doing some social emotional intervention or counseling through your equitable multi-level system of support, and the student's still struggling despite all that, that's you know, a sign the student may need some additional support. Observations in academic, non-academic, we talked about that. Interviewing the child, what is the child's view of their behavior? The parent, the teachers, and it says S, teachers, right? Interview a positive adult, I'll talk about that in a minute. You want to review past records and look at standardized rating scales. Standardized rating scales, again, these are rating scales about a student's social emotional needs or behavior that are kind of, you know, what they have done is they have had research conducted on them with student populations to ensure that, you know, if the ratings are more significant in some areas, that indicates more likely that the student truly has a disability. IEP teams must also look at those ecological factors when observing and in interviews. I can't go into depth about this, but one of the things that's part of our entire comprehensive special education evaluation framework is we're really promoting something that a lot of people have been using for quite a while, especially school psychologists, called the Riot and ISIL matrix. RIOT stands for Review, Interview, Observe, and Test. ISIL stands for Instruction, Curriculum, Environment, and Learner. So the idea is that to identify a true disability, you should look at what does that student's instruction look like? What does the curriculum look like? What does that student's learning environment look like? What does the learner look like, right? Sometimes we just focus on the learner and that's it. You also are reviewing data, you're interviewing people, you're doing observations and tests, things like those. I talked about those standardized rating scales, those types of tests. So you really want to be looking at the whole student and their environment and the interactions when you're considering whether or not they have an emotional behavioral disability. And RIOT and ISIL is actually a great approach for an evaluation for any of the disability categories. Additional requirements, the IEP team considered the effects of any known history of trauma or mental health disorder on the student's functioning, and you do not identify or refuse to identify emotional behavioral disability based solely on known history of trauma or mental health. So it doesn't mean that trauma means that student has an emotional behavioral disability. It doesn't mean that they don't. It's the impact of that trauma. But if they have a trauma history, we want that data at the table so it can be discussed. Another important point, IEP teams discussed and determined based on information and data collected whether the behaviors that you're seeing of the student are a result of a difference between the norms of the child's family and community or an emotional behavioral disability. And I would love to tell a story right now, and I'm going to probably do it really quick. I knew a behavioral consultant that worked at Disability Rights Wisconsin named Mark Sweeten. So this was a story he told once, and I absolutely loved it. He was called in, this must have been years ago, on a case where a student was suspended from school because he hit another student. And the student was suspended for multiple days because the student would not say he was sorry because they put a condition that students had to say he was sorry before he came back to school. So the behavioral consultant was called in because the student wouldn't say he was sorry and they weren't letting him back into school and they wanted him to talk to the student. So in talking to the student, he asked the student a simple question. I heard you won't say you're sorry to the student for hitting him. Did you hit the student? He said, yes, I hit the student. And you won't say you're sorry? It's like, I'm not saying I'm sorry. And he said, the key question, why won't you say you're sorry? And he goes, and what he found out was the term sorry in this student's understanding meant that I'm a loser. I'm not going to call myself a loser. I'm not sorry. And so Mark said, well, will you apologize to the student? He says, yeah, I'll apologize. And it's like a simple word kept a student out of school. Now, that's just a very discrete example, but that's a difference in ecological factors. That's a difference in language. That's a difference in subjective understanding of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. I mean, and that happens all the times in schools. And we're just asking IEP teams to really look and make sure that there's not cultural differences that are causing these difficulties with the student, because we know that those exist. We hear from our students and families that these exist, and we need to have honest conversations about them. The other cool thing about this rule that I love is that the IEP team for a child being evaluated for emotional behavioral disability may include, it says may include, but we highly encourage, a staff member. LEA stands for Local Educational Authority, so it's the school or district staff member, identified by the child when possible as having a positive or most positive relationship with the child. This is such a cool kind of like recommendation in the rule, and we really hope that IEP teams do this. And if you're a parent, I would say, hey, who has the most positive relationship in the school with my child? Can they be at the IEP team meeting? Because that is going to show their perception of that child is going to add additional information and discussion to that IEP team. And we know that's a factor around resiliency for students. Now I'm going to talk about specific learning disability. This is super quick. As I said, if you are conducting a specific learning disability assessments and identification process, nothing has changed if you're doing that in a public school for a publicly enrolled student, including charter schools. If you have a child in a parentally placed private school, or if you're homeschooling your child, an emergency rule went into effect that allows school districts to use something called significant discrepancy to assess the child in a private school or home-based private educational setting when considering the disability category of specific learning disability. So we at DPI also proposed to make this significant discrepancy for consideration of specific learning disability in private and homeschool settings, part of the permanent specific learning disability rule. That's the only change right now we're requesting for permanent. We did actually have a rule that we thought was really good, but we pulled that had some other changes to specific learning disability. Others did not feel that it was something that the legislator felt should be passed, so we pulled it. But we have had unanimous consensus from private school folks, public school folks, parents, others that really feel that this is needed. Because the current requirement is that you would have to, prior to this emergency rule, you would have to do those 2 scientifically research-based intensive interventions in the private school. And some private schools may not want to do that. And so it causes difficulties, or maybe the parent may not want that, et cetera. So if they're enrolled in a parentally placed private school. So that significant discrepancy is now an option. You can do the 2 scientifically based SRBI scientific research-based interventions and do all the other components of identification in a private or homeschool situation, but it gives this additional option that you can use significant discrepancy. And this is kind of explains the rule that applies to students enrolled in public school, including charter schools, requires that 2 scientific research-based interventions. So if you're a parent with a child enrolled in a private school, the IEP team may use significant discrepancy right now as part of the emergency rule, and we'll see if that becomes a permanent rule. And just the definition of significant discrepancy, it compares assessments of a child's intellectual disability or IQ with how much progress they are making academically, academic achievement. All right, lots of resources. Every one of these rules has a comparison chart. There's videos, there's dig deeper modules, there's FAQs. This isn't even everything. The best place to go is, I'm going to go to a document. This is, if you're interested in hearing regular updates on all this stuff, you can subscribe to our collaborative special education support email list. But if you're looking for a one-stop shop, I think I put it on here. Here we go. This is a web page that we've been updating, and there's lots of good information on this page, but you can either go to each of the disability categories and go to that criteria dropdown I showed you, but here's like the major rule change documents for each of the disability categories. So you can see emotional and behavioral disability, we got videos and documents. Speech language impairment has a number of things, and there's even more on their website. And then this is a little document that summarizes that criteria for emergency rule for specific learning disability. And then we have all of our sensory impairments up here as well: blind and visual impairment, deaf and hard of hearing, and deafblind. All right. Woo. What questions do we have?
Well, we have a couple. One goes back to the deaf-blind category, and it states, if a student qualifies for deaf-blind, how do you document that on the evaluation report? And then also, do you need to fill out the criteria sheets for blind and visually impaired, and also the deaf and hard of hearing as well?
Ryan, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
Sure. So the first for the deafblind criteria, that is on section 3A of the ER1, where all the criteria categories are listed, and you would check the box for deafblind. And I think, Daniel, you probably can speak more to how to document that criteria.
Yeah. Please ignore my scrolling really quick, but I'm just going to go up to the, oh, here we go. So you can document, if this, you can use both the disability category criteria IEP forms, that'll be IEP forms next year, they're worksheets right now. You can use those And if the student meets criteria for both deaf or hard of hearing and blind and visually impaired using those criteria, yes, that would be documentation. The other option is that you have to document that the combination of which causes severe communication and other development and educational needs, such that the individual disability-related needs of the student extend beyond instruction and supports required for students solely deaf or hard of hearing and solely blind or visually impaired. I would encourage you to contact the Wisconsin Deafblind Technical Assistance Project to kind of tease out this second one here that talks about this other option for documentation, and also look at the additional guidance resources, because they'll talk a little bit more about what they're going for with that ability. What they wanted to do is to basically say, you know what, they both have to have some documentation of deaf or hard of hearing and blind and visual impairment, but if for some reason they don't quite meet that criteria for both of those, but there is clearly needs around being deaf, hard of hearing, and blind and visually impaired, and a lot of these students have a lot of other disability related needs in other areas as well. But they wanted to make sure that students can still be identified as deafblind under that. And WDB TAP is really going to help you walk through those conversations.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a couple of others I'll try and get through, and just so that everybody knows, we'll go over for a couple of minutes now, so we have a few more minutes. This says, I'd like a clarification on something. In order for a student to be eligible for specially designed physical education, the student must first be determined to have a disability category and then meet criteria for specially designed physical education, correct? And then the second part of it is there a Wisconsin DPI state level specifically designated or designed physical education eligibility criteria like in Minnesota, or does each district in Wisconsin have their own specially designed physical education criteria information?
Sure, that's a great question. We have this beautiful bulletin index, and I always go here, and I'm just going to put, let's see. So we have a beautiful physical education for children with disabilities bulletin, and this will get, if you just go to DPI physical education bulletin, you will find this, and it will answer all your questions. I'm not an expert in specially designed physical education, also sometimes referred to as adaptive physical education. I do know that a student does have to have an IEP. It is an IEP service outlined in the IEP. And I believe Wisconsin Facets, one of our experts on that, was maybe doing a webinar coming up at some point if they haven't done it already, Eva Kabinski. But if you have any questions, at the bottom of any of our pages, you see this contact special education. Go to any of the DPI special education pages, click on that, enter your question into this little form, and it'll get routed to a specialist who can answer your question for you. It also has a phone number here if you prefer just to call.
Okay, another question is, I think this might be from a parent. Who can I contact to look over an IEP for some questions I have about the denial of a summer school speech program?
Good question. So, anyone that calls the department with concerns about their child's IEP development or IEP implementation or decisions made with the IEP, there's in general a number of dispute options that you have. Obviously, if you can't work it out with the IEP team and you come to an impasse, you could request mediation through the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System. If you want DPI to make a decision on whether the district's decision was in line with state and federal special education requirements, the only way that we can tell you whether or not they were right or wrong in a sense is to file a state complaint, and folks like Ryan do an investigation. And there's also a due process hearing request dispute option. You certainly can contact the department and ask questions around what is required, but we can't, we don't know your student. We can't know the full context without doing an investigation. So actually, we don't really look at IEPs and make decisions outside of those formal complaint process, and et cetera. But if you have general questions about like what are the requirements, things like that, certainly contact us and we'll give you the kind of factual information. And then if you feel like it sounds like the district maybe didn't make the right decision, you can pursue one of those dispute options. I know Facets also, if you call their helpline, they'll walk you through and provide some guidance as well to you.
Thank you, Daniel, for mentioning it. I was going to add that as well. Another question for you is, do you have any suggested questions for interviewing parents that would get at family norms?
Well, that's a great question. I know that Tim Peerenboom and Eva Shaw is our emotional behavioral disability consultant, Tim Peerenboom is our school psychology consultant. They're doing a lot of the guidance around this. And Tim and Eva have and I don't know it off the top of my head, so if you could contact special education and ask that question, or email me if you find my name, or find Eva and Tim online. There's a observation book for culture responsive interviewing that they said was really good. And it might have been, I think it was around interviewing. And we were trying to get the author of the book to come to Wisconsin and do a presentation, but I think they're a very busy person and haven't gotten back to us, or we may not be able to offer them what they would need. But we could share that name, and I apologize, I don't know the name of it. But there's someone I could lead you to in a follow-up. And I would also say check the current web page and follow up, because Tim and Eva would be able to provide you with some recommendations. And I know that coming forward, we're going to have more resources on observation and interviewing generally. We're working on those now as part of our comprehensive special education evaluation suite. So watch for those. But if you want, I'm sorry, I don't know can't remember it off the top of my head, but could hook you up with that if you follow up with us.
And then just a couple of comments that as follow-up were, people were glad that specialists in specific areas are now being required to be part of the team, the IEP team, because they felt that would definitely add a wealth of information and help people make better informed decisions.
Great.
That was one comment that we had. And then another comment, which is really interesting, says, since there's been a lot of changes in language, when or is the title of special education maybe going to be changed?
Yeah, that's a great question for your federal legislators, right? Just like other states, we tend to follow the Individuals with Disability Education Act language, and as you know, it hasn't been reauthorized in quite some time. And I'm sure I have teammates. We have this conversation all the time around language, and language constantly evolves our thinking, and language is attached to our belief systems and our views, whether they're asset or deficit based. And we've tried to make some shifts around comprehensive special education evaluation to get people needs focused instead of so hung up on labels that they're not addressing clear needs of students who have been found eligible for special education. But yeah, that's a great question. But I would say probably for us, it might take a change in federal, but yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's something that would be good to bring to our Council on Special Education. If anyone's listening right now too, if you go to the Council on Special Education website, this is who advises us at DPI, and we do have a number of seats coming up and terms ending. And if you're interested in serving, I would encourage you to serve. And specifically, we are very much dedicated to matching our council membership to the racial and ethnic diversity of Wisconsin, and highly encourage any staff or families or people with disabilities who identify as being a person of color and considering council. But nominations are definitely encouraged for all as well. And if you're interested, you should join us so that you can have these types of conversations with us at DPI.
Well, thank you so very much, Daniel and Ryan, for your presentation today. I'm sorry for those who had to leave early and that we ran over, but I thought it was a great opportunity to be able to get as many questions answered as possible. So we'd like to thank both of you for your presentation today. I know that I learned a tremendous amount, and I'm sure that those in participation did as well. So this will conclude our webinar today. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Please be advised that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 trainings and webinars for the year 2022, and that please check out our website calendar and register for any of those trainings that you may be interested in. And please watch for the short evaluation coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, thank you both to Daniel and to Ryan, and everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks again. Bye-bye all.